Good morning again, everyone. Have you ever had a conversation with someone where you share something difficult? It could be something like really difficult or just something moderately difficult, but you share something, maybe something's happening in your life. You might have just lost a job, and so you're sharing this with someone, and their immediate response is something along the lines of, everything happens for a reason. Right? Thank you, Karen. That's exactly what I needed at that moment. No shade to Karen, sorry. Some of us, it seems, were raised with this spiritual gift called finding the silver lining before the person has even finished sharing their story. And today we hear Paul say in Romans, "Weep with those who weep." Somewhere along the way, it seems like we've gotten better at saying, "Have you looked on the bright side?" And while these statements are often well-intended, sometimes gratitude can become a way of escaping discomfort instead of holding space for compassion. And we know a lot about gratitude. It restructures our neural pathways and releases happy hormones like serotonin and dopamine. Regular practice of gratitude actually suppresses stress hormones like cortisol. What we don't often think about or discuss is the shadow side of gratitude. In fact, I have to just insert something in here. It should never surprise me, yet it always manages to, how we plan worship services, and Jim plans the choir anthems like what, a year in advance? I mean, it's a long time in advance. And today, the choir anthem about the shadow, we're starting a worship series this morning all about the shadow side of gratitude. Isn't that funny? Aristotle noted how all virtues can become vices when they're tended to poorly. And he observed that virtue involves doing the right thing at the right time, in the right way, with the right motive, toward the right objects and people. In Psychology Today, in an April installment, there's a series of articles that was begun. It was the first installment in what will become kind of a mini-series by Dr. Joel Wong that focused on the virtues and vices of gratitude. The image that you have in your bulletin is part of that image that was in Psychology Today. And so Reverend Paul Grossman has crafted this into a sermon series that we're going to use for the next 4 to 6 weeks, and it's called Rogue Gratitude. And each week we're going to discuss and consider a different side, a different shadow side of gratitude. We'll talk about weaponized gratitude and corrupted gratitude, performative gratitude, and today's focus, toxic gratitude. And so before we get too far into things, I want to define what we're talking about when we talk about toxic gratitude. It's that pressure to feel thankful before we've felt any of the other wide range of human emotions. So that pressure to move right from an experience to thankfulness without first grieving or feeling sad or being confused. This morning we read, "Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep." And it's interesting to me because what Paul does not say is fix your feelings or look on the brighter side of things. This idea of a Christian love and Christian community and this unity of body isn't about emotional correction. It's much more about compassionate presence. And if we're honest, we often rush to that silver lining side of things because pain makes us uncomfortable. Often the things that we're dealing with, the grief that comes in this lifetime, is unsolvable. Silence is awkward. And sadness reminds us that we have very little control over things, even when we like to think we have more than we do. And so our tendency becomes, instead of accompanying people in suffering, we try to manage emotions. And the thing is, our bodies can't ignore pain. And that's why I think it's so important that Paul uses this image in 1 Corinthians of the body, because it's deeply emotional and relational. If one member suffers, all suffer with it. Think about how ridiculous it would be to say, if your heart stopped pumping, for your body to say, "Oh, but my brain's fine. My cognitive function is okay. At least. Could be worse." The body responds to pain with attention. Pain in one part of the body is not an interruption to community life. It's a holy aspect of community life. Toxic gratitude tells us to move quickly through it. But the gospel says something very different. And we see this in the example of Jesus. Jesus never rushed grief. Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus, even though he knew that he would raise him. Jesus cries out at the cross, even when he knew how it would end. The Psalms are filled with lament and anger and confusion and sorrow. And what this tells me is that God doesn't shame human emotion. We're a resurrection people, but Christian hope makes room for wounds. And our human rush to find that silver lining is deeply rooted in our culture. A culture that rewards quick answers and avoids vulnerability. A culture that prefers performance over honesty and mistakes a constant positivity for maturity. And digital culture trains us to react instead of listen, to curate an image instead of confess what is true for us, to argue when we disagree instead of accompanying other people's opinions. As a community of faith, we're called to live differently. And the hard part of authentic Christian community is that it requires emotional courage. quick to listen and slow to speak. Build up rather than tear down. There's a significant difference between toxic gratitude and holy gratitude. Toxic gratitude tells us, don't be sad. But holy gratitude recognizes that we can be grateful and grieving at the same time. Toxic gratitude responds with things like, it could be worse. But holy gratitude makes space for joy and sorrow to coexist. Toxic gratitude tells us to just be thankful for what we do have. But holy gratitude understands that our pain deserves witness. And the answer to toxic gratitude is truthful compassion. In the article that I referenced earlier, Dr. Wong says this: a more compassionate response is empathy. Listen, care, and validate someone's pain. Ironically, that genuine support often becomes the very thing people feel the most grateful for. Research on individuals engaged in writing their deepest thoughts and feelings about stressful events found that those that made the most gains in physical health after this practice of writing used more positive emotional words, but also included a number of negative ones. So the people who healed the fastest definitely focused on the positive, but included the negative. He says, embracing the duality of our emotions, both positive and negative, may be an important part of the healing process. It's so interesting. I spent time yesterday. I just had the privilege of spending time yesterday with one of our churches, one of our United Methodist churches, and I was there to facilitate a mediation between some of the church leaders and congregational members and the pastor over an injury that occurred in the church a couple years ago that they want to heal from and move past and move through together. And so I was doing this work with them, and the last thing we did together was we created an agreement. And it was kind of a 3-part agreement. And the first part was a confession, like we confess that, we choose to. And as we were doing this exercise together, we came to a point where there was some disagreement about what it was that they wanted to put the language around the we confess part, like we acknowledge. It was the acknowledgement of the pain part. And they got really stuck on whether or not to name very specifically this event that occurred or to use more broader language and just kind of describe it in general terms. And what they decided together was that it was much more powerful if they actually named the thing. Uncomfortable. In fact, one of the participants said, if I never hear this word again, it will be too soon. The temptation was just to general it up, and everyone will know what we're talking about. But instead, they recognized that to actually heal through this and to come to any kind of real resolution, real Christian unity, they needed to name it. It was fascinating. So the invitation this week is this: Instead of rushing to find the silver linings, would we just practice presence? Would we sit with someone in silence? Would we sit with ourselves in silence, even if it's just for a few moments? Can we practice listening without fixing? Can we validate someone's pain without correcting it? And this even applies, and maybe especially applies, to our relationship with God. Could we practice honest prayer? Can we come to God with gratitude and anger, if that's what we're feeling? Lament and confusion and hope, all at once. God can handle the complexities and the dualities of this full range of human emotions. My guess is part of the reason that God gave us them is that we could have this full experience of what it means to be truly and fully alive. Our church, the church, is not called to be a factory that pumps out positivity. We're called to be a body. Bodies that know this truth, that when one part hurts, the whole body pays attention. That faithfulness isn't rushing to find a silver lining, but instead learning how to stay present in that dark space long enough for grace and love to do that healing work. May it be so. Amen.